there was that question about, there were two questions about feminism. I understood the second one. I didn't understand the first one. Can you repeat that first question? Which really had to do with, it was mention of, well, let me not say mention of what. What the first question?
Maybe the issue actually is to try and simplify what the class is saying about those concepts. And I'm not sure if Dr. Moses wants to try and clarify for us. Please. Yeah.
Okay. The question, in South Africa, most feminist conversations are centered mostly around heteronormative, even gender-based violence campaigns tend to focus on heterosexual women, thus completely erasing or ignoring the experience of the queer people who are either gender non-conforming, transgender, or homosexual. What role do you think African feminists and the justice system need to play to ensure that the queer people also get social and criminal justice without being victimized for being queer?
Identify that we have among us different communities where in abbreviation we say LGBTI, and then we have Q, right? You do know those abbreviations. Q is non-conforming, meaning I don't conform to the characteristics of this community or versus that community. I am an individual. Do you understand? So that group is feeling marginalized when we speak of heterosexual relations, heterosexual policies, heterosexual laws. So they don't want to be in an instance where they become rape victims. So when they have to approach police stations, they want to define themselves as pure, other than what you are seeing as a black woman. But they go to an extent and say that black women pure. You just, when you write the word queen, you take the N at the end and you put the R, meaning I'm non-conforming to the characteristics of any that has been mentioned by society. Do we understand? Yes. So how do that?
No, let's discuss this question, because surely all of us here, and surely Timali will say this and Unisa will say this, that we should all of us be opposed to violence against women and do whatever is necessary to combat violence against women, yes, regardless of the sexual preferences of a particular person. Yes. So I don't understand why the question arises, because we're saying that we're against gender violence, violence against women, and must deal with it. If you say, I talk to a police officer, I should say to the police officer, you know that this is policy, very important policy, so do whatever it is that is necessary to be done to make sure that we stop this violence against women. Now, the police officer shouldn't say, when there's a woman who appears with a blue eye and all that, to say, are you LGBTI or not? Because it's entirely irrelevant. It's entirely irrelevant because the challenge is to make sure that we end the violence against women. I'm saying, regardless of the sexual orientation of the woman, And there's absolutely no reason to be asking about sexual orientation when you're dealing with the matter of the challenge of violence. You see, unless there's some other argument that society generally will say we're against violence against women, talking about heterosexual women, but we don't mind violence against these other women who are AQ or whatever. Sure. If there is that phenomenon that I'm saying, yes, we're against violence against women, except those women who are LGBTIQ. If there is such a problem, that's a problem that we must attend. But otherwise, I'm saying that I think we should, all of us, very firmly stand on this position of hostility to all violence against women.
And in class, Mr. President, we said when we speak of heterosexual, when we do the policies and so on, we are looking at the numbers of women who are victims. So the numbers are not the same in terms of the other group. We're looking at, just like when we're looking at gender-based violence where men are also victims, we're not talking about men because the numbers are not the same, but we do acknowledge that men can be victims. Just like we do acknowledge that the LGBTIQ can also be victims of gender-based violence. But when we speak, we're speaking of the numbers being high within heterosexual relations. So in class we did mention that the reasons behind the main focus being in here and then how we draw our policies is because of the numbers. In the high incidence of femicide in South Africa during the past few months, we're speaking of that. We do acknowledge that there are some other communities whereby, you know, there could be femicide, there could be brutally rape and so on. But in instance of where the attention is within the heterosexual, which, and again, my students are here to verify that point after hearing from your side.
Yeah. No, thanks. Let me first of all say welcome to everybody. I want to join the Vice Chancellor, Professor Makanya, in saying welcome to this Timali course, and indeed hope that we will achieve these objectives that we have set ourselves with regard to what Timali has to achieve in terms of helping to develop these change agents that we say the continent needs. I was very pleased when Professor Gumente was challenging everybody to answer instead of putting questions. Because I think we need a bit of a discussion or a dialogue among ourselves as part of that process of building these change agents. And I thought the questions that were put are relevant, are very relevant to that task. And when comments have been made here about when our colleagues were responding to the question whether it is possible to achieve the African Renaissance, and one of them was saying there is a challenge of leadership in this regard. I thought that was a correct response. That this is one of the tasks that we face, and indeed, this is the very reason for the existence of Timali, is to create this kind of leadership that our continent needs in order to be able to address these various matters. So I would really hope that as we participate in the studies within the context of Timali, we should do this with the understanding that the task is not only to understand, it's short, it is to understand better all of these things we're talking about, but in the end, the challenge is to change. To change this reality for the better. What is it that we will then do which would make us better able to bring about the changes that the continent needs, and therefore that's a leadership question. So a question was asked about that, about leaders who do not want to bow out of power, and impact on good governance and so on. And again, Professor Gumede was saying, what do we mean by good governance? And suggestion that it seems that African societies accept this matter about leaders who don't want to bow out of power, what is to be done. But I think I would hope that we, in whatever course we are engaged here, we actually discuss this question at some depth to understand the phenomenon. Because I do not think it would be the same in all countries. And the understanding of the origins of this and what it means. I think it's important to study the phenomenon I'm saying in the specific circumstances. You see, you could have a situation where somebody stays in government for many years. For instance, I don't know for how many years Angela Merkel in Germany has been Chancellor of Germany. I can't remember. But I mean, there are elections coming up in Germany soon. And what I read in the media is that she's likely to continue to be Chancellor. So, well, does that mean she doesn't want to bow out of power? Is there anything necessarily bad if the German people believe that Angela Merkel is a good Chancellor and therefore they want to keep her? I don't think there's anything that's against good governance if there's a process by which there's a democratic a renewal of mandates like that. If you take us here on the continent, there's this very prevalent provision in the African constitutions that presidents can hold power for no more than two terms. Why is that necessary? It's a question that really we need to pose. Because again, let me come back to Germany. The Germans don't have any such provision that chancellors can only be elected for 2 terms, as far as I know. And nobody has said, therefore, that Germany is not democratic. I know the British, they don't have a restriction like this. The Prime Minister can only be elected for 2 terms. And nobody has said the British are not democratic. This issue arose here on our continent in a particular context, and very understandable, because you would remember this question that was asked about, is it possible for the African Renaissance to be achieved, etc., and obstacles to the Renaissance. You remember all of this period, the early period of independence on our continent, of military coups and all of that. One-party states, etc. And then around 1990, you begin to see this process of change, where the Africans themselves say that we've got to walk away from this experience of military governments, of one-party states and so on, and they say, let's have multi-party democracies, etc. And we don't want to repeat this experience of people staying in power forever because maybe they've got guns or whatever. And hence the introduction of this notion of 2 terms. It's what I'm saying, because in a particular context. And therefore there is nothing, Professor Makani, as far as I can see, which says if there is a country in the continent, in Africa, which does not have these term limits, therefore by definition is undemocratic. then I'm saying that you would have to say very many countries around the world which don't have term limits are undemocratic. And that would be correct. Or that such absence of term limits necessarily indicates bad governance. And that's why I'm saying that I think we would have to understand this thing in its concrete form, in its specifics. You've got President Paul Biya, for instance, in Cameroon. I think he is the longest serving.
30 years.
Oh, 30 years.
30 years. 3-0.
3-0. Now, I do not know what the circumstances are in Cameroon which result in President Biya staying on for 30 years. And I think the next one would be President Obiang Wema in Equatorial Guinea. Would the circumstances be the same? Or President Mugabe here across the border? I think we would have to look at these things in a specific form in order to be able to make an impact on it. I have a general statement which says, don't stay for too long. It raises a question, what is too long? And what is too short? At the center of this surely must be the consideration, I think, our starting point. Our starting point must surely be this, that we must repeat this concept that the people shall govern. I think that's our starting point. That the people shall govern. Now, therefore, you see, let me just talk about this briefly. You have this debate that's been taking place in South Africa concerning this issue of vote of no confidence in the National Assembly, on the vote of no confidence in the President of South Africa. And an issue has arisen about who mandates the MPs. And part of the argument, as you know, has been that the members of parliament are mandated by their political parties. And therefore, what they do in parliament must be consistent with what their political parties say. There's another argument that some of us have advanced, that members of parliament are mandated by the people, not political parties. Because in the end, if people end up as members of parliament on the basis of being elected by the population of South Africa, not because they are elected by members of their parties. And indeed, that's what the Constitution of South Africa says, that these members of parliament are representatives of the people of South Africa. Now, I'm raising that thing because it comes back to this question that the people shall govern. Do we say the people shall govern, or do we say the parties shall govern? And I think we will say the people shall govern. And in the course of the people governing, we must then determine this issue. How long do these people who must govern, how long do they want to keep Thabo Mbeki as their leader? If the people say, no, we've had enough of him after 2 years, then he must go. But if they say to him, we want him still after 15 years, why is that undemocratic? it may very well be that somebody stays in power for 30 years, not because the people want them to stay in power for 30 years, but because it's got a means of intimidating the people so that the people are unable to say no. Then we are dealing with a situation where the people are not governed. That's why I'm saying critical to an understanding of this thing must surely be whether the system of governance we're talking about is expressive of that idea that the people shall govern. And not be governed by some kind of arbitrary rule that you will have good governance if the president stays for 8 3/4 years, then that equals good governance. If it's 7.5 years, whatever. It can't be like that. So, and in the end, therefore, I think it becomes a responsibility of the population in each of our countries to take this decision that what we have here does not represent the will of the people, and that must change. And that relates to this matter. I'm saying that the matter that was raised about leaders who don't want to bow out of power. Yes, indeed, they are. But I'm saying the fundamental issue then is what is it that we do in order to ensure that the people govern? Because this thing about leaders who don't want to bow out of power is a manifestation of a malfunction in terms of what we would expect when we talk about the people shall govern. There's a question that was raised about a drop of support for civil society. And after 94, I think the description, the explanation that was given is correct about the drop of support for civil society organizations after 94. The drift of intellectuals or that kind of contribution out of civil society organizations into government. And therefore generally the weakening of the civil society organizations. But I think that we, again this is, we must consider this matter within a particular context. Because I think there was a reference, for instance, to Pirosho Kamei. Pirosho, a long time ago, was very much active in the trade union movement. You are talking about a period pre-94 where you've got a mass struggle to defeat the system of apartheid. And so the youth, the women, the religious people, the trade unions, everybody, the cultural workers, and everybody is mobilized, intelligentsia is mobilized to pursue this one task of the defeat of the apartheid system. And together with that, you of course also have other activity which also is anti-apartheid. So for instance, to the extent that we have people who are involved in education to say that we don't want band education, and therefore we set up alternative educational systems and raise money for that, and we have civil society organization that's dealing with education. Or lawyers who are going to be defending people who are appearing in court, or medical people, and so on. Or the black, what we call by the Black Consciousness Movement, the projects that they started for development and so on. So I mean, this is civil society pre-94. And the reason you have this great, strong, active civil society is because the people generally are united in the struggle against apartheid. whatever form that engagement in the struggle takes. And obviously, it comes liberation in '94, the things that we're fighting for, a better education, development in terms of health, you know what I mean. We've now elected our own government, let them do these things. Naturally, there would be that drop in the support in terms of civil society organizations. It's not accidental. And part of the problem here, I've said this before and get myself into trouble. You know, when we talk about non-governmental organizations, a non-governmental organization should not depend on government to fund the activities of a non-governmental organization. The British, I have said, the British have got something called a Kwango. A Kwango is a quasi-non-governmental organization. They call it a Kwango because it calls itself non-governmental, but it's funded by the government. So they say it's quasi-non-governmental. Because by definition, non-governmental organizations ought to be funded by the people, not by governments. But here, historically, we're talking again about this period during apartheid years. A lot of your support for civil society came from funds generated from the rest of the world. Whether it was the Swedes or the Norwegians or the Germans or whoever, people were contributing to the struggle against apartheid. And that includes governments in terms of those countries. Those governments, of course, naturally comes freedom, democracy in '94. Those governments, therefore, obviously will say, now we're going to support this democratically elected government. And the expectation here, I think, was that then the government would then replace the resources that were lost as used to come from these Western countries, that it must now be generated locally. So it's possible that government can very well decide that it's important to have the civil society organizations active in this field and the other field, and therefore must be funded. It is very correct and very proper. And to have those sort of quangos, as the British call them, it will be quite proper, but clearly, I think you would never have a restoration of civil society movement in the same way that you had it pre-94. Because I'm saying there's now been this intervention of the presence of government, which will then do a lot of the things that civil society organizations used to do in the past. So how to mobilize civil society in terms of, the question was, in terms of pursuing, for instance, the objectives that have been set by the African Union. So I really think this is a matter of levels of consciousness among our own people about this. I don't know what is the level of consciousness in the country about what are the tasks and what does the African Union stand for and what kind of support the African Union needs. I know that there is a student society at WITS, at the University of the Witwatersrand, which set itself up, students who set themselves up with the specific purpose of supporting Agenda 2063.
Yes.
But these are students who are conscious of the challenge we have as South Africans to be part of the process of the development and the renaissance of Africa. And therefore they looked at Agenda 2063 and they said that we must do whatever we can in our own country to generate support for that Agenda 2063 of the African Union. So I'm saying it's a matter of the political consciousness among ourselves. And perhaps if we are interested to do this thing, which was called mobilizing civil society for support of the AU, is really to do that political work. The things that we are studying here at Timali, to communicate this to the wider society, that this is what the African continent needs. And all of us as Africans need to come and engage these issues. And I think that's the only way we can address this particular issue, which is the mobilization of civil society, as it was said, in order to pursue these matters that have got to do with the objectives and programs of the African Union. Which perhaps comes back to this thing about, question that was raised about the obstacles to the African Renaissance and whether the African Renaissance can succeed. I think Professor Gumede should have asked this question. It was answered. Two of our colleagues said, of course, it can be. The Renaissance can be achieved because it depends, it's in our hands, we must do it. But we have asked the question, what do we understand by it? When we talk about an African Renaissance, what are we talking about? Because I understand sometimes, I'm told that some of our people here at home are very enthusiastic about the African Renaissance because they think that when we talk about an African Renaissance, we're talking about a return to the manner in which the Africans behaved in the 18th century. Reflects the Renaissance of in particular, I'm told around the gender issue, that really to be the African Renaissance means the woman in its place. So I'm saying that's why this question, what do we understand by this African Renaissance? Surely, because it can't mean that. It can't mean regression. And really I come back to what I was saying earlier, that you had this period in the early years of African independence, when you had these military coups, one-party states, economic systems that were not functioning, the growing impoverishment of the people. Somebody talked about industrialization and even about South Africa deindustrializing. I mean, we have a whole period with very negative features in terms of the development of the African continent in the post-colonial years. And in the end, the African people say, no, but we can't continue like this. We need to abandon the policies and programs and so on which have resulted in all of these negative features. So what do we want? We want democratic systems, not these one-party states and the military rule and all that. Coming back to this question about the people shall govern. That's what we want. We want to change these economies so that we don't have this continuous process of the further impoverishment of the people. We want to eradicate poverty, unemployment, and all of those things. You recall, for instance, Professor Makanya here would know this very well, that at a certain point, a lot of the independent countries, the governments in our independent states, they basically turned against universities because the universities became centers of protest against misgovernance. Things were going wrong in these African countries, and the intelligentsia in the universities, both young intelligentsia and the grown-up intelligentsia, would combine and say, but these things are going wrong. And a lot of governments saw the universities as centers of opposition to them, and therefore took actions really, which resulted in cutting of funds and all of this. arrest of lecturers and students. So I'm saying a general decline in the quality of higher education. I'm saying the African people were saying that we don't want that, we want the opposite with regard to all of these things. So when we're talking about the renaissance of Africa, a rebirth of Africa, it surely must be that we want Africa reborn from that negative past. So that all of these things about a democratic Africa, an Africa where the economies are growing, an Africa in which the wealth is shared by the people, an Africa which takes its rightful position in the system of international relations, and all of that. That's the kind of Africa that must be reborn. And surely all of those things are realizable. And again, I think the responses that were given, they were correct. Of course, these things can be realized because these things, it's in our hands. We can do this. If we decide not to do it, of course, then it won't be realized. But there's no particular reason why we shouldn't succeed with regard to achieving that rebirth in our continent in the way that I've described it. Not that it will be easy, but it can be done. As I say, understood in this context of this is what we mean when we want a rebirth of the continent. To answer the question, what kind of Africa do we want? And this is the kind of Africa we want. We don't want an Africa which is ruled by old men who don't want to leave power. We don't want that. We want an Africa which is governed according to the will of the people. And there must therefore be that freedom and capacity. We don't want an Africa where the women are treated as second, third, or fourth class.
Yes.
And the matter about so these matters about gender equality and so on are very much part of that process of the renaissance of the African continent. And we can achieve all of those things. And indeed, I'm sure that is exactly the reason why all of us are here at this Timali process, because we want to be that kind of change agent who would help to produce those sorts of changes on the African continent. The two questions were asked here about industrialization and trade barriers, African trade barriers, breaking those down. You know, and was reference, I think, to Agenda 2063. Many years ago, it was again part of this process of this renaissance of Africa. It was basically three of us came together and said, South Africa has been liberated, so this focus which the continent as a whole, through particularly the Organization of African Unity, the focus that the continent had in the struggle to end apartheid, in the struggle to end colonialism, and therefore to ensure the liberation of Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola, and South Africa, etc. That struggle has succeeded. We now have continent liberated from colonialism and apartheid. It's important that we should focus on the matter of the liberation of the people from poverty, underdevelopment, and so on, and mobilize the continent around that objective. So fine, and that is where that is the origins of what ended up being called NEPA, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. Now, if you look at that NEPA document and what you intended, we're talking about the need to ensure that the African economy changes direction. Because I'm saying historically, for a number of decades after independence, what you had were economies in decline on the continent, which was why you then have the process of the further impoverishment of the African masses. We're saying that that has to change. And the way to change it is to ensure that we have an African economy that grows and develops. 3/4 of the African population is in the rural areas, dependent on agriculture. So we need to have a policy on agriculture, agricultural development. What should be done about it? So indeed, therefore, there was adopted what was called the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. We looked at all sorts of other things, dealing with industrialization, dealing with this matter about trade barriers and all of that. It was a comprehensive program about the socio-economic development of the continent. We also understood that question that was raised about WTO and so on, that you could not ring fence the African economies and say that we are going to grow and develop just among ourselves without relationship to the rest of the world. It's not possible. And therefore that new partnership for Africa's development also sought to define a partnership between Africa and the rest of the world, apart from the partnership among ourselves as Africans. There's also a partnership with the rest of the world. So I'm really saying all of this to say there was actually a very comprehensive program that would deal with issues of industrialization, that would deal with the issues of removing these African trade barriers, that would deal with the issues of restructuring the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world, economic relationship. That includes issues of debt and whatever else. Issues about the trade relations between Africa and the rest of the world, and therefore matters that relate to the WTO. You would remember, for instance, that the last round in the WTO World Trade Negotiations was called the Doha round. It was the Doha Development Round. And the reason it was called the Development Round was because we had inserted exactly this point, that the trading system globally needs to be such that it impacts positively on the matter of development of the underdeveloped countries. And therefore you needed an international trading regime which would help in the struggle to defeat underdevelopment and poverty. So that's why it was called the Doha Development Round, which failed because the major economic players in the world did not want a development round to succeed. But I'm saying that in the context of NEPA, this is part of what we're trying to address, this relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. Now I'm mentioning this because for some reason, what was a very comprehensive perspective about African development, which would deal with issues of industrialization, deal with issues about breaking these African trade barriers, disappeared. It vanished. It's completely out of sight. And the way it happened was we then agreed. We agreed with what was the G8, these 8 developed countries in the world, that we needed to find a partnership between Africa and themselves, so that they must look at their economic policies towards Africa and make sure that those economic policies towards Africa are consistent with what is said in NEPA. So their support, they must be supportive of this development program, which has been elaborated by the Africans themselves. So they agreed. We set up a joint committee, which was to deal with what was in the agreed document. It was called mutual accountability. So that we as Africans would say, look, we made a commitment, we will do the following. And they, these Western countries, would then say, sure, we make our own commitments to do the following. So we have a mutual accountability system, so which used to work. And then so each year, you remember the G8 would meet every year. And we would attend those meetings of the G8 to discuss the implementation of this common program that had been agreed, with them supporting Nepal. And what happened was that each host country, as the G8 moved from one country to the other, would then choose an element. Maybe I should have said this. When the G8, when we said to them, look, you must support what we say in Nepal, so they said, okay, we look at Nepal. They did, and then adopted what was called the G8 Africa Action Plan. So they had the G8 Africa Action Plan, which was supported by Nepal. What then happened is that, as I was saying, was G8 met from country to country. Each host country would pick an element of the G8 Africa Action Plan to focus on. So for instance, when we went, they met in the UK, in some year, I can't remember what year it was. The British government decided they wanted to focus on the matter of the external debt, the debt issue. It's an important question, but let's focus on the debt issue. So what we agreed, let's focus on it, and good decisions were taken about that. When they met in France, the French said, water is very important. Let's focus on the matter of water. And we agreed because water is important. And then I think the Italians, and the Italians or the French, said that we need to attend to the matter of maternal health and infant mortality, those sorts of questions. And we agreed, no, we have to do that because they're important. But what happened in the course of that is that gradually the G8 Africa Action Plan disappeared. As each one of these countries chose particular elements of the action plan, the rest of the action plan was forgotten. G8 Africa Action Plan was adopted in Canada in 2002. They next went back to Canada in 2010, the G8. So we discussed with the leadership on the continent at the time to say to them, look, we are going back to Canada to 2010, where the G8 Africa Plan was adopted, which has vanished. Can you please raise it? So they agreed. But in fact, it did not even appear on the agenda. What I'm saying is that that entire plan, drawn up by the Africans about African development, is collapsed. It's no longer on the agenda. It was on the agenda of the UN, it was on the agenda of the G8, it was on the agenda of the WTO. It's no longer there. Even among Africans, us Africans, we now have to produce Agenda 2063. We have an agenda program. We've done it. Why are we trying to reinvent this thing? Now, so I'm answering the question about industrialization and African trade barriers. The matters were thought through, and I don't think we should go back to the reinventing the wheel. I think if we take the NEPAD thing and dust it up, the NEPAD program remains as part of the AU programs, and to check with them how far are we with regard to all of this. I think we would find the answers, even I'm sure as we are studying here at Timali, I think we'll find answers to these questions about industrialization and trade barriers. And it will be important to do that. Because when we ourselves ignore what we ourselves have produced in terms of our own future, we can't complain when the Western world, because it does not agree with what we want to do among ourselves, when they decide, let's do everything, we can forget about this thing, which they did. Now, I'm saying we forget, we follow in their footsteps ourselves. And that surely cannot be right. So I'm saying, Professor Kumete, that perhaps that's part of what we can do here at Timali. Let's have a look at that NEPAD program, and let's have a look at what has happened since it was adopted, because the NEPAD structures remain, including their secretariat, which is still here in Midrand. What have we done about this? And maybe we might find that it's also integrated into this 2063 project. But I think that's where the answer will be with regard to these questions related to industrialization, African trade barriers, relations with WTO, and so on. And to say that about the WTO, I don't think that the African continent can walk out of the WTO. It's because the African economies, you cannot disentangle them. You can't separate them from the rest of the global economy. We produce gold in many African countries. We can't eat it. So we're going to sell it to someone. And diamonds and platinum and all these things. Sure, I mean, we don't do disentangle. We can't extricate ourselves from the global economy. And therefore that's why we can't extricate ourselves out of the WTO. But we need to make sure that the WTO has the development agenda as was visualized when it was decided to have that Doha development round. That's what we need to do, not to say we can, to think we can walk out of onto the WTO. We can't. Even in terms of, never mind the trading issues, even in terms of just attracting investment, just attracting investors like this country, we need foreign investment. And the reason we need foreign investment is because we're not generating enough money domestically to do all the investments that we need. So we got to ask somebody else elsewhere in the world to say, please help. We want to open factories, new mines, build roads. Don't have enough money. Come and help. So in the end, I'm saying that it's not possible for us to extricate ourselves from the WTO, but we need to make sure that the WTO addresses this matter of the challenge of development and therefore the eradication of poverty on our continent. And the last question in my notebook here, it talked about the preferred African system of government. Well, I don't know what that would be, except that, as I was saying, surely this thing must be very fundamental, that we must say that the people shall govern. And having said that, then we can discuss the matter about the institutional framework which would express that notion, the people shall have. I think really that's all we should say about this preferred African system of government. That centrally, that's what really surely what it needs to be. There will be challenges, like the traditional institutional government. How do we deal with it in the context of the notion the people shall govern? There are issues that must be raised in that context about the gender question. What do we do to make sure that when we say the people shall govern, we actually mean the people shall govern. We don't mean that the men shall govern. So what I'm saying at the center of this surely is that notion. In terms of a preferred African system of government, this must be what stands at the center of it. From your notes, is there anything else out there?
About...
No, yes, and there's something else.
Yes.
The question we talked about this issue about gender against women and LGBTIQ. But about the second question. Yeah. There was a second question which was, if we had a woman president, would it help the matter of emancipation of women? I'm sorry, I've been talking too much. No, my view is that, you see, it would be wrong, it would be very, very wrong to say this matter about emancipation of women, empowerment of women, gender equality, that this is a responsibility of women. It can't be. You see, here we talk about, at least on the ANC side, the National Democratic Revolution. It surely must be one of the central features, this matter about emancipation of women, of the National Democratic Revolution. So that as revolutionaries fighting for the victory of this revolution, one of the things that we want to do is to achieve women's emancipation.
Oh, yes.
Not a women's. So I don't think therefore the issue therefore arises, if we had a woman president of the republic, would it help? I don't think it would if the rest of the movement is not committed to this. You can have a poor woman sitting there as president and blame her that nothing has moved. When in fact, if the rest of society, never mind society, if the rest of the movement, a progressive movement, is refusing to engage the issue, she'll fail. No. Not because she's not committed and all that. But of course, if the democratic movement fails to understand that one of its tasks, by definition, is this matter about emancipation of women, then it doesn't matter how many women presidents we elect. They won't succeed. So I'm saying, therefore, it's not the matter of the emancipation of women. It's not just the responsibility of women. It surely must be the responsibility of the progressive movement as a whole. And I think that indeed even the election of a woman president would itself be a reflection of the understanding of by that progressive movement of its responsibilities. But I think, Vusi, that is right.
Thanks, Patron.